If there's one thing that you can't knock McFarlane for, is to take a chance on some lesser known versions of certain characters, particularly when it comes to the Bat family. Take the Stephanie Brown Batgirl here, for example. No idea who this character was. I saw this pulled from the new McFarlane Toys Phygital wave as part of the No Man's Land inclusion, which I did receive directly from McFarlane Toys directly to cover on this channel, so shout out to them. But rest assured, my opinions are going to be my own. And seeing this character here, I thought to myself, yeah, I'm not necessarily well versed on all the Batgirls. I know, of course, we had the archetypal Barbara Gordon. We had other iterations, but I never really heard the term, or rather the full name, Stephanie Brown tossed around. So I did a little bit of research, and in layman's terms, she's a bit of a troublemaker, to the point where it's like, you know, you're done goofed when you even have one of the Robins saying, you get out of here. Get out of here. You're fired. So pretty bold for McFarlane to be giving her the McFarlane Toys Phygital treatment here, and with felt goods no less. So, seeing as that this is the first time that we're getting a to-scale DC Multiverse 7-inch figure, and I really do mean to scale because she is a little bit on the smaller, shorter side, so she's not necessarily going to be the full 7 inches, but at the same time, if anybody was waiting for McFarlane to check off the Batgirl Stephanie Brown off the list, then you're gonna more or less be a little happy with this iteration. And I'll definitely emphasize on the less part, but for the more here, you'll see that the color scheme is actually doing a little bit better for me in physical representation before me, because when I saw some of the initial photos, I thought to myself, well, you know, the purple and the black, you know, it's looking kind of okay. It's looking a little too edgy. It's kind of reminding me a little bit of Gotham Knights, the video game, which I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of, but seeing it here in 3D, in materialized, it's definitely a little bit better in person. It's doing that whole illusion thing that we as action figure collectors have to sometimes sort of accept, that some figures simply just look a little bit better in person than initial photos, especially since it's not necessarily purple with black. It's more so black as the dominant character, with purple being sort of secondary, though you have a good chunk of that sort of plum color kind of encompassing the sides of the legs here, the boots, the gauntlets, and then most definitely the bat symbol and the belt right here at the center, which in my opinion are probably the focal points of the figure as far as the suit is concerned. And to give credit, the design of the character from the comics and being represented here in three-dimensional McFarlane Toys form, it's a pretty cool design, albeit a little bit too busy with these sort of rectangles here on the side of the thighs. But when it comes to like the belt and the bat symbol specifically, I actually do like the design and the aesthetic of the way that they managed to graph these pieces on top. And I feel like they managed to at least emboss a little bit of the bat symbol right on top right there. Trust me, I'm trying my absolute best to not be creepy the way I'm doing it right now, but that is in fact a grafted on piece. So it's not just a simple paint app. You have the little ridges embedded inside of the boots as well as the gauntlets, though I kind of wish that there was like some emblematic spikes to kind of mimic that of the rest of the bat families here on the side of the gauntlets right here on the forearms. But at the same time, that's more of a design thing that wasn't necessarily present in the comics, so you kind of have to take that up with them. What was also present in the comics that I'm genuinely surprised that McFarlane was able to replicate here with felt goods no less is not only this purple cape, but also the hood encompassing the head sculpt that is also made out of a felt good fabric here that is pretty much a cloth, but also encompassing on the rim at the hood here is a legitimate wire very similar to that of the cape. So not only do you have a wired cape, but a wired hood no less that you're able to sort of stylize and futz with to then kind of form fit around the actual sculpted hair and part of her head sculpt. So that's pretty cool. A little bit on the pointy side, but there's not much that you can really do here at that scale because that's going to naturally happen with this sort of fabric. But at the same time, the fact that it is cloth and it's actually separated from the remainder of the cape, so therefore you're able to still complement the articulation, which we'll tackle momentarily, is commendable. Further still, the fact that you're able to technically pull down the hood, and they stylized it and stitched it, tailored it rather, to be a little larger. It's funny, it's doing this really cool thing where they made it out of a fabric, or rather a cloth, that looks pretty form-fitting, but can technically still stretch somewhat. It's not necessarily spandex. It's not. It's still fabric, but it's utilizing this sort of method to where if you're careful with it, don't go all crazy, but simply just give it a slight little tug, and you can in fact pull the wires down to then take the hood down to the bottom of the neck and reveal the fully sculpted blonde hair that is done, for the most part, pretty nicely. I say most part because though I do like the little brushes of paint to make it look like actual hair strands right there that are done pretty vibrant in a way to make it look like legitimately wavy, strandy hair. You also have this ponytail piece here towards the back that is technically articulated, as you kind of see right there, but I don't know how well it's going to come across here on camera, but the first time I messed around with this ponytail here, when I was done, I moved my fingers away and my index and my thumb fingers were completely covered in like this little mustardy yellow residue. So maybe, I don't know if that could be considered a QC problem, because technically no paint actually rubbed off the hair sculpt there, so it's looking pretty nicely still. Nothing to really complain about thus far, but the fact that some residue needed to be washed off afterwards as a side effect of messing around with the ponytail back here that is, like I said before, a little articulated, I think it still needs to be brought up during a review, especially when you take into account that when you move the ponytail, it does kind of bring a little bit of attention to the large segmentation of the added piece of the two ponytails here towards the back that you can blatantly tell are completely glued and grafted on towards the back right here. So that's the one thing that the hood is going to be able to do, is cover up that very garish seam towards the back. But on the bright side, it's able to highlight a little bit more of the face sculpt as well as the paint applications behind the eyes that definitely have a very edgy and rebellious personality to them. It kind of fits the personality of Stephanie Brown and what she's sort of infamous for. But of course, you have the mask covering up the bottom part of her faceplate, and then naturally you have the wired cape here towards the back, which I appreciate. The very rigidness of the wire feels pretty strong. It's actually one of the more firmer wires, one of which I wished was included in a different figure that was part of this wave. If you haven't already checked out my No Man's Land Batman review, go and check it out. But this is exactly the wire that could have... I simply just don't understand why it couldn't have been included with that Batman, especially when you're not necessarily paying all that much for a brand new buck, since you're simply just taking the Nightfall buck again, whereas Stephanie Brown here is arguably utilizing much newer parts, and yet she's the one that gets the very rigid wire inside of a fabric cloth cape as opposed to the nylon one. Though, to be completely fair, I do feel like maybe the tailoring of the cape could have been done just as well as the tailoring behind the hood, because unfortunately I do think that the tailoring towards the bottom here is a little off to the point where if you take the cape and kind of put it in a neutral pose or in a neutral stance like this, you have like this part of the center of the cape kind of coiling a little bit and kind of standing out. I don't know what it is, but it just feels kind of ugly. So say, for example, if you extend the cape, it doesn't look too bad, but when you kind of take it and put it in a neutral position, it's sort of crinkling just a little bit too much for my liking towards the back here, that it sort of lifts naturally on its own, and I kind of wish that they would have done something to remedy that. But the cape's tailoring is more so a nitpick compared to probably the biggest problem I have with this figure, and to get to that, we need to tackle the articulation, of which I sort of already foreshadowed a bit here with the head, because like I mentioned before, you have the ponytail that you can technically kind of rotate on its axis, but then you have the head that is still able to rotate the full 360 degrees, even with the hood. So you can either have the hood pulled down, though it's gonna be able to be pulled simultaneously along with the head sculpt. So if you want to kind of have it be pulled up and still rotate the head, you can still do so. And doing so will still allow you, because of the hood being separated from the cape, to rotate the head the full 360, as well as being able to tilt up and down pretty generously. Side to side is a little limited, but I want to attribute that more so to that back hair piece that is making up those two little pigtails towards the back. So again, probably the inclusion of that instead of being a little more raised is not only, like I said, probably would have been a solution to keep that seam from being very apparent without the hood, or at least allowing a bit more of the articulation. The top arms, if you're able to move the cape wire out of the way, can still rotate the full 360 no problem, as well as being able to extend off to the sides, and even a slight little bit of butterfly mobility, not as much as some other Bat family members, but you can technically still move it front and back and even shrug up and down. The bicep swivels have no problem rotating 360. 2 elbow joints that can fully bend all the way up like so, and then of course you have the ball joint at the wrist that can fully move the hand up and down as well as rotate 360. Torso is a little on the strange side because the mid torso has absolutely no problems. You're able to rotate it the full 360 as well as being able to extend off pretty far back, but it does create a little bit of a gap right about right there. Crunching inwards is a little bit more on the limited. It kind of stops a little dead here before it's able to push a little further. You're able to technically crunch a little further via the waist joint and extend off towards the back and side to side a little bit, a few degrees more, but not by much. And it technically can still rotate the full 360 at the waist, no problem. But then we get to the top leg joints. And this is mainly where I felt a little icky with this figure, because here I thought, thinking that, oh wow, Stephanie Brown is getting a brunt of really good, brand new, or somewhat recycled pieces. I didn't necessarily think that they were going to utilize the term recycling a little too literally, because when moving the top leg joints, I moved the legs upwards like so, and that's a pretty fair distance right about right there, as well as towards the back about that far, and it's able to fully split off to the sides the full 180. It's in doing that movement that then I was like, ugh. Guys, I don't know if it's present visually on camera, but take my word for it. These thigh pieces right about right here are incredibly cheap feeling. They feel very hollow, almost to the point where they almost feel like plastic shells. And if you don't really believe me, take a very closer look at the surface of the front of the thighs there. You have a combination of some lining that is purposely sculpted to mimic that of her suit from the comics, but next to that line, you can blatantly see you have the plastic seams from the manufacturing appearing just right next to it. And I'm like, yo, you guys couldn't like put the seams in the back. I mean, you have seams in the back. You can blatantly see them right there as well. But on the back, you at least have the mercy of the cape being able to cover them up. You have more seams here towards the front, the assembly seams from manufacturing. And it's one thing to have the seams very prominent in the appearance, but it's another to have the legs feel just a little cheap. Every time I move these legs, I always feel like they're very brittle and they're gonna break. Not necessarily because the articulation is limiting, but because I do feel like there's not much in the form of density inside of the thighs to keep that from potentially happening in the future. So it's a shame that something that is at this level of cost from McFarlane Toys did manage to make a little bit of a shortcut here in the form of the thigh manufacturing. And it makes it pretty ironic that the rest of the leg feels more or less fine, especially when you get to the knee joints that can fully bend all the way up, no problem. And you have, of course, more ball joints at the ankles that can fully bend the foot up and down like so, rotate it all the way around, and even have a little bit of a pivot incline, and toe articulation that can fully bend the toes almost all the way up like so. So those don't feel too bad. But it's mostly those thighs that I'm like, yo. And it's sad because this is one of those cases where when you really think at the ratio of amount of plastic that feels hollow versus the rest of the figure that feels more or less solid, it's still so aggressively hollow and cheap feeling that that's all I'm really going to be able to think about when it comes to posing this figure for a character that I previously didn't have that much exposure to. So in the form of a McFarlane Toys Phygital no less, which of course comes with the card that you're able to use to redeem a Phygital, or rather a McFarlane Toys digital interpretation of this character. And redeeming this particular Batgirl code did result in an epic drop of the Stephanie Brown figure. And even though I'm kind of indifferent of getting a sort of maroon colored variant as opposed to the purple and black, I did appreciate that this time she came with all of the accessories that are actually held together here in the physical box, as opposed to what happened with the Berserker, where he had like the rocket launcher in the actual digital drop, but not physically in the figure. So this time it was more so one-to-one of a representation, and I appreciated that. But she also comes with a gold-plated Batarang that's very similar to the emblem that's on her chest, which I do like that it's a nice little callback to the specific design of that bat symbol, only in Batarang form, so that's pretty cool. But also a grapple with a with the handle that looks suspiciously like a legitimate firearm. But at the same time, it feeds into her personality, the more rebellious troublemaker. So only makes sense that her grapple is quite literally a gun, but repurposed to be a grapple to legitimately launch this little hook here at the front, chrome plated and with the little line right there coiled in a dynamic animated fashion. Pretty interesting, but again, I'm just cracking up at the fact that that's pretty much a legitimate Glock there at the end, only with a grapple. So that's probably how they were able to get by with that 14 plus rating, because if it wasn't for that grapple, they would be in a world of hurt over from WB. But again, it's a personality thing that makes sense and kind of, again, brought some attention to the character to people who have probably never heard of Stephanie Brown, myself included. It's just a shame that there were some shortcuts taken for either the tailoring of the fabric cloth cape that I've always been a fan of, but most especially those legs that just make me feel like I'm scared to legitimately post some of the legs, because I feel like at any point I'm going to hear some sort of crack and everything just comes apart. And when you're dealing with a figure that is not necessarily as exposed as your traditional Bruce Wayne Batman characters, Batman figures, Bat family that have had this legacy of exposure to be able to warrant decent pickups up on the shelf, and also be a part of a wave that is technically a Phygital wave with already the inclusion of a digital collectible that is more, whether you like it or not, is upticking the price. You need to make sure that shortcuts are not taken, and I can legitimately feel them in my fingers as I messed around with some of those legs, and that's something that very late in this game cannot be afforded, and therefore the Stephanie Brown Batgirl is going to be getting a 6 out of 10. Would have been a 7 if, or maybe even an 8 if it wasn't exactly for those cheap filling legs, because apart from that, I was able to look past the tailoring of the cape, the futzing with the ponytail and the residue, etc., because again, I warmed up to the color scheming. I warmed up to the character of Stephanie Brown to the point where I even went into a deep dive as far as her lore background and how she fit into the Bat family. But seeing as you're only able to make a first impression once, this wasn't necessarily that bit of a home run. So I guess this begs the question, do you think that at this point, McFarlane will create some kind of red platinum variant for the spoiler utilizing this exact buck, and maybe that could be a second chance at filling in those cheap filling legs or doing something about that cape? Maybe that could be a form of redemption, or is that something that will come a little too late? Too late. Do you guys want to see a spoiler figure, or do you want to see more of Stephanie Brown later down the line? Let me know down in the comments, and while you guys are down there, hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this review, thumbs down if you did not, and as always, stay humble and take care.